everyone. Welcome to another Random Talk Sunday, and today I'm going to be taking a fan request and discussing in particular a science fiction slash sort of horror film titled Pandorum. I believe this came out in 2009, if I'm not mistaken. And sort of give my thoughts on it. I don't think it necessarily belongs in any particular category. I think this film is just sort of a kind of just a, a film on its own, more so. I don't think that it really is technically underrated or overrated or is a classic by any stretch of the imagination, but somebody wanted me to do it, and I thought it would be kind of interesting to talk about since it isn't a film actually that I have heard of, so I figure it's always good to find new content that is out there and sort of go into my thoughts around it. So, in case you are not familiar, this particular film involves a Corporal Bauer and a Lieutenant Peyton who end up sort of waking up in a hypersleep and are sort of suffering from a little bit of amnesia in that they don't know really, what their mission was initially when they were sent on a mission to space. And you will discover sort of what that mission is actually really within the beginning of the film because it literally spells it out for you right at the beginning as to what kind of ended up happening and what ended up sort of kind of resulting and ended up creating the mission. But they unfortunately don't know within the beginning. They're kind of out of it and not really sure what to do, but they kind of get the idea to get the ship supposedly going again through some kind of reactor. And eventually they come across some other characters and also these creatures. The creatures I don't think are as well explained within this film, even though there's actually a significant amount of exposition sort of within this film to a certain extent. And the best way in which I can describe sort of the tone and the overall kind of atmosphere of this film is think of the series Underworld, but in space. And that's kind of this movie. It kind of has that sort of feel to it. It's very gritty, dark, all of that. So if you really love sci-fi slash horror movies, like if you're really hardcore on this, you're gonna love this kind of a film. For me, I'm not really so hardcore into the genre. I mean, I do like some of this genre that's within this genre. This film I thought was okay. I didn't think it was necessarily as great or as good, but it still has some interesting ideas. I just have certain issues with it, but I still have some things that I did somewhat enjoy from it. So the first thing that I think works well with this film is the overall premise. The way in which the mission is sort of established and sort of set out, and the things that are sort of involved, and the twist sort of that kind of ends up occurring towards the end of the film, I think ultimately works to its advantage. It brings out a lot of interesting ideas thematically, like of, you know, sanity and, whether or not to help life, or destroy it. There's all these kinds of different concepts that's kind of trying to play around with that we don't oftentimes see within these kinds of sci-fi films. So it's kind of nice that it's kind of bringing these concepts and ideas out there. And I think sometimes overall these things end up being well presented. But I think there's some things that are a little bit flat as well and are not as engaging for me, like the characters. I don't think the characters are all that compelling within this movie. It was really hard for me to remember their names. It was hard for me to kind of remember, you know, the sort of, again, there really wasn't a huge amount of development with the relationships. A lot of it was more about getting to point A to point B, an action sequence, all of that. So it really was a more plot driven piece, I'd say. Although we do get a little bit of a backstory of one of the main characters, it's not necessarily that fleshed out. Um, so I think within the character department, it wasn't as strong, or not as strong as I kind of like these sorts of films to be with the characters. Sometimes I just prefer uh, that there is a certain amount of kind of more context given to them, and they, and I think that's the problem too. Is they just came up as kind of just bland to me, and I didn't really feel too much for them. I just kind of felt like I was kind of taking a backseat, sort of enjoying the atmosphere and the tone and everything and all that, but not really getting invested into the characters and their whole entire kind of struggle, I guess you could say. So I think that's the thing that sort of discouraged me and kind of took me a little bit out of the film, unfortunately. Um, and also the way in which this film kind of explains things. Um, some of it kind of was a little bit difficult for me to really grasp around, and I don't think they really explained certain aspects fairly well. Um, and I think there's the creatures is supposed to be some kind of metachlorians, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. I'm not really, again, I don't really know too much about sci-fi and video games, because this was kind of a little bit like a video game a little bit as well. So again, if you really love video games and you really like video game storylines, this is probably another one of those films that will really significantly appeal to you. But again, it just didn't seem like, fully okay. There were some aha moments, but then it was kind of like I felt there was a little bit too much of a shroud in other aspects within the film that weren't really explained, and I think could have been explored a lot more extensively, and could have uh, potentially led to uh, a lot more of an investment for me. Um, so I think that's really my honest opinion when it comes to this particular film. I think what its ideas and its overall approach and tone, I think, really works, because it knows what it is. It knows the genre that it is representing. It knows the concepts it's trying to bring about. It knows the kind of uh, feelings uh, and approach it wants to ultimately take. But I think, when you really get into the characters and, the explanations into things, it kind of seemed a little bit like there were just parts where I felt like it was not as explored or as um, interesting or engaging to me. So again, it has some good points to it, and I think it's interesting if you are very into this kind of a genre, and if again, if you liked Underworld and you enjoy that genre extensively and you would like to see that in space, this is pretty much the film for you, because it's kind of a lot like it. It's very similar in how it approaches it overall. Um, so I think that's really, I guess, all I can really ultimately say about it. I mean, it's not necessarily bad sci-fi. I mean, there's obviously a lot worse sci-fi films that I have seen extensively. Um, but there's also ones that I feel are a lot stronger than this particular film, actually. So it's kind of, this one's kind of in the middle for me. I mean, I don't think it's horrible by any stretch of the imagination. I think even Rotten Tomatoes was a little bit harsh on this film. I mean, it gave it 28%. I'm like, oh, ooh, no, that's that's not good. But I think obviously sometimes, again, sometimes there's always these biases that the certain what sites have, and usually I go in with these things with a pretty open mind, and I obviously feel like the 28% is way too harsh for this particular film, because I think it is trying to bring out some interesting concepts here and some good ideas and trying to bring out some interesting storylines. Um, but at the same time, I think there is still some things that are not, again, as well thought out, and I think could have been more thought out, like the characters and, the explanations of how certain things operate, and, um, those I think were just a bit lacking. But overall, it is very interesting, and I would really recommend it to people who really enjoy science fiction. If you like science fiction, and you like the more, and if you like the more actiony type science fiction, again, this appeals to you. However, if you're very on the boards of realism, and you're on the you're more onto the in-depth character side of uh of, of films, this will probably not appeal to you as much. But I think overall there's certain parts, again, that work, and then there's certain parts that didn't work for me. But overall, I think it's worthy of a recommendation if you like this kind of a genre. And again, if you would like to see Underworld in space, this is the movie for you. But yeah, I think that's really ultimately all I can say, though. If there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year. And that's really my honest opinion of this particular film. But until next time, everybody, bye bye.